God in prayer. God, we thank you for all the different ways that you reveal yourself to us, Lord, in the creation and the people around us, and the challenges that we face each day and the opportunities we face each day. And God, we thank you for the way you reveal yourself to us in your word. God, as we turn to your scriptures now, we pray, God, that you would give us eyes to see you and ears to hear you. You would give us hearts and minds that are open to how you might be shaping our lives and speaking into our lives through your scriptures. And Lord, we pray that this time of reflection might encourage us and strengthen us, and also might bring glory to you. It's in your Son's name that we pray these things. Amen. About 7 years ago, one of my favorite writers, somebody who I've talked about a lot, I know, from this pulpit, Wendell Berry, gave a lecture. And I'm sure I've quoted this lecture at least a couple times in the years since, but I'm going to do it again today. The lecture was entitled, "It All Turns on Affection." And it opens, as so many of Berry's essays do, with an attempt to make sense of his own family history, as a history of small farmers living in a rural Kentucky community. And taking that history and relating it to some larger cultural phenomenon. In this case, Berry talks about and posits two categories of people. And these are two categories that he borrowed from his own teacher, a writer named Wallace Stegner. According to Berry, Stegner divided Americans into two types based on their inclinations. He says there are boomers and there are stickers. This is not in relation to baby boomers, but boomers of another kind. Boomers, said Stegner, are those who pillage and run, those who want to make a killing and end up on Easy Street. Stickers, on the other hand, are those who settle and love the life that they have made and the place they have made it in. And for Berry, so much of the hope that he has for the future hinges on the affection that stickers have for the simple but significant context in which they built their lives. I've read Berry's lecture every couple of years since he delivered it, and I never cease to be amazed at how pointedly it questions some of the chief doctrines of our culture. The way it insightfully tunnels down to explore and critique the tendencies toward disposability and transience and carelessness that mark so much of life in the modern world. But to read Berry's essay just as an objective critic, and just as one who's content to cast judgment on others, to cast judgment on an abstract culture that has gotten it wrong, well, that's to miss the point. See, there are always going to be these vague enemies that we can criticize for failing to see or embrace the truth. But the real question is whether I, as a reader, or maybe just as a human being, can see these same tendencies at work in my heart, in my life, in my own restless spirit. And the answer to that, as you can probably guess, is a lamentable yes. When I look at my own inclinations, I'm far more likely to see the impulse to always be looking to the next thing, to always be pursuing the next entertainment or excitement, to constantly be shifting my attention toward distant horizons, instead of focusing on the things and the people and the challenges and the opportunities that are right in front of me. And I suspect that in this struggle, I'm not alone. This has always been a difficult task for human beings. And the world in which we currently live, which is a world that's shaped by technological advances and innovative shortcuts and perpetual promises for instant gratification, this world certainly doesn't make it any easier to focus on what is right in front of us. And so into this world, we need to welcome voices like Wendell Berry, who challenges us in all of his work to look to the stickers, to look to those who love the life they have made and the place they have made it in. Those whose affections for their surroundings and for the people with whom they share those surroundings allow them to resist the constant pull toward discontentment and disillusionment. And I have to confess, and maybe some of you do too, that in this I am still growing. I still have a lot to learn. And I'm thankful in the midst of this growing and learning process to have encouraging and challenging examples to call me back to where I need to be. Some of those examples are here in this room. Some of them are people that I read their work, like Wendell Berry. And another one of those examples is the Apostle Paul. So we've been spending the past several weeks journeying together through some of Paul's most intense and challenging writings, the letters to the Corinthians. These are letters that Paul wrote to people living during a tumultuous time. And it was a tumultuous time not just in the history of the church, but really it was a tumultuous time in the history of the world. To be a Christian in the Roman Empire was always to be living a somewhat unsettled existence. It meant that you were a minority on the margins of society, uncertain about what the next day might bring in terms of persecution or some other hardship. But even more than that, the situation of the Corinthian church, these people that we've been reading about over the last several weeks, it was unique because of its cultural and civic context. One commentator, Theme Perkins, has noted, this was an urban church. It was a collective of people who made their living in the bustling marketplace rather than in the quiet countryside. See, the city of Corinth was a trade center. It was a cultural hub. It was a kind of intellectual crossroads where ideas and innovations and money and power all came together. In other words, Corinth was kind of a boom context. It was a place where there was always something new to try out. There was always somewhere new to go. There was always some new opportunity to make money or some new way of life to embrace. And for those who had the means to engage in it, life in Corinth would have been fairly exciting. But as we know from our readings in the book of Acts and also just from what we know about early church history, the Christian community in the first century was by no means an elite gathering of the upper crust. There were certainly some people from those more elite segments of society in the church, but the vast majority of believers would have kind of lived at a subsistence level. They would have toiled through their days and their nights in anonymity. Life for these people was hard. Life for these people was often relentless. And so there would have been a temptation for these folks to always look to the boomers, to indulge in envy and disappointment, to be contemptuous of their own lives while they longed for another. This temptation would have been great. This temptation would have been ever present. When you add to this the competitive and divisive spirit that we've already seen at work in the church, it's not hard to see why Paul saw these things as very real problems. It's not hard to see why Paul felt the need to speak a hard truth to those who wrestled with these temptations. And so into this context, into these challenges, Paul writes some powerful words. They're words that, though they were first penned 2,000 years ago, challenge us in real and important ways today. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 follows up on the difficult passage that we talked about last week. Last week we looked at what Paul had to say on sexual immorality. And here Paul's talking about marriage. And as Paul does continue in this passage to talk about matters of immorality, he approaches the challenge that these kinds of issues pose to the practice of living out marriage faithfully. But he does more than that in this passage. He also takes the opportunity to address some root problems, some deeper matters that affect not only marriage, but also affect a number of other areas of life. And as we discussed briefly last week, the Corinthian church was falling prey to some of the same temptations and struggles with sin that had captivated the larger culture. And this included some of the ways that Corinthian Christians were failing to embody marital faithfulness. So Paul does address this in chapter 7. He talks about the context of marriage, and he talks about the context of singleness as areas in which we're called to be committed and consistent and obedient to the commands that God has laid out. Then about halfway through the chapter, the passage we're going to look at today, Paul expands his thought to touch on kind of a wider-ranging definition of faithfulness. So let's read what Paul has to say here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning in verse 17. He says, "Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's free person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. Now, Paul covers a lot of ground here, and there are certainly some statements that he makes here that might be kind of puzzling to us. He talks about married people seeking to be faithful in the context of their marriages. He talks about single people seeking to be faithful in the context of their singleness. He even talks about slaves seeking to be faithful within their context, and people who are circumcised or uncircumcised seeking to be faithful within that context, whatever their status is. And what's so fascinating about this passage, and what at the same time is so powerful, despite some of the cultural and other kind of puzzling things that we might encounter, is the way that Paul manages to address so many different areas of life under the same guiding principle here. And that principle is this: serve God where you are. Answer the call wherever you receive it. Step into God's plans wherever those might unfold. This is such a simple message to articulate. It's such a simple message to hear, but it's such a hard message to follow. Sometimes this is hard because of us. Sometimes our inclination to want to be somewhere else or to be someone else gets in the way of us serving where we are. Sometimes we think, if I were just older, or if I were younger, or if I were married, or if I were single, or if I had kids, or if my kids were older, or if I had a different job, or if I lived somewhere else, there is so much that I could do. And it's difficult living in this world not to think this way sometimes. The fact that the constant media that we engage presents us with literally endless alternatives to our own life doesn't make it any easier. See, there's always going to be some other version of ourselves that we might fall into the trap of thinking is the better one, or the more exciting one, or the more fulfilled one. And once we start down that path, it's really hard to come back. Once we start to think that our faithfulness is dependent on whether or not our life matches up to some preconceived notion or some fantasy that someone somewhere feeds us, it can be hard for us ever to hear God's call clearly. It can be hard for us ever to respond to God's call decisively. And a couple of things need to be said here. First of all, this is not an invitation to complacency. This is not a command to always stay put, no matter what God might be revealing about his plans for you. And Paul seems to acknowledge that here in his words, but also in his own life. I mean, after all, the man who wrote these words changed his name. He left his career as a Pharisee. He spent the rest of his life traveling all over the Roman Empire in obedience to the call that God had placed on his life. So for Paul, responding to that call, being faithful in the midst of his context, meant giving up a lot of the things that this world told him would make him happy, giving up a lot of things that this world told him would make him fulfilled, and accepting the direction that his ministry took him, accepting the context and the situation into which God was calling him to live out his faith. As he would later write, through this process, Paul learned the secret to being content in whatever circumstances he found himself. In other words, he was able to stick. He was able to root down into God's will. And he was able to find stability. He was even able to find peace in the most unstable of circumstances. Even when Paul was in jail, instead of wasting time wishing he were somewhere else, although I'm sure, as anyone who's ever encountered or known someone who has been in prison knows, that temptation would have been ever present and even understandable. Paul strove to be faithful and even to minister in that circumstance. It also needs to be said here that Paul's words are not meant as a sanction for those who would create negative circumstances for others. And I think culturally, when we read some of what Paul has to say here, we might wrestle with that. Just because Paul tells wives to bear with their husbands, that doesn't mean that abusive husbands or husbands who make life hard for their wives are off the hook here. Just because Paul tells slaves to be faithful does not mean that Paul is saying slavery is a God-ordained institution, as lots of people throughout history have sometimes said. I think sometimes we as Christians need to be conscious about how we can work to help others flourish within their circumstances, how we can help others overcome and escape some of the profound challenges in their situations while still being faithful to the context in which God has called them. And also as a community, as a church, I think that we need to think about how we create space or how we fail to create space for people to be faithful. The Bible commands us to serve where we are. The Bible commands us to respond to God's call in the places where God has planted us. And so it makes sense that God's people, we in the church, need to cultivate those spaces faithfully so we can help people hear and discern God's call for them. Maybe this means we foster a space where married people can pursue faithfulness in their marriages, where parents can pursue faithfulness as parents. Maybe this means we foster a space where single people are encouraged to follow God's leading in the midst of their singleness, or where married couples without children can be faithful in that context as well. Maybe it means we don't ignore the contributions of young people. Maybe it means we don't overlook the possibility that the older people among us have a lot to offer. Maybe, especially in a smaller congregation, it means that we have to be extra attentive for creating opportunities for people to be faithful in this context, rather than feeling that they have to go somewhere else or to be someone else for God to really use them. These are all challenges. These are going to take place in the midst of a lot of different conversations, one-on-one, as a group, in a lot of different contexts that we find ourselves. And it's hard to know exactly what this is going to look like in every situation. But I do believe that God has called each of us to be faithful where we are. God has called each of us to be open to his leading in the midst of whatever situation he has planted us in. Whether we're talking about a family situation, or a job situation, or a church situation, or a community situation. Whatever that might be. And I also believe that we as the church can and should help one another as we seek out opportunities to answer God's call. As we seek out opportunities to love the life we have made in the place where we have made it. And also as we seek out opportunities to live out our potential together. So as we continue to pray for each other, as we continue to build each other up, as we continue to learn what it means for us to be the church, let's train our attention on that. Let's train our attention on thinking about how we can help one another live faithfully in the context where God has planted us. As young people, as old people, as workers in various fields, as parents, or as children, as brothers and sisters, as husbands and wives. Wherever we are, whatever situation God has planted us in, there's always going to be the temptation to think about, well, what would life be like if I were somewhere else? Instead, let's help one another discern what it means to be faithful where we are, what it means to be faithful in listening to God's calling, where he has planted us, so that together we can live into that call and serve God's purposes. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the words of your servant Paul. Lord, we thank you for the ways that he tells us to embrace your kingdom where we are. God, we thank you for the encouragement we've heard from in this space, Lord, in the songs we've sung, the prayers we've prayed, in Rob's words this morning about thinking about how your kingdom comes alive among us. God, that happens in so many ways. It happens in so many different opportunities and in the midst of so many different challenges, and we pray that we would be faithful in those things. God, we pray that we would live as if the greatest thing that anyone can know about us or say about us is that we are a child of your kingdom. So that wherever we are, whoever we are, whatever we're doing, we're able to be faithful to that kingdom. And God, give us discernment, give us understanding as we seek to help one another figure these things out together. Help us to be the kind of community where people's gifts are encouraged, where people's circumstances are encouraged, and where we're able to lift one another up. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus, that we pray these things. Amen.